Hi everyone. Thank you so much for joining today's webinar about bridge strikes in partnership with Backhouse Jones. We're just going to wait a couple more minutes for more people to join. So it won't be long now. While we're waiting, James, can you just tell us a bit about your experience in the industry so far? We'll probably start in about a minute's time.
Yeah, no worries. Yeah, you don't want me to go on for the next hour and a half. Starting in a minute's time. You've got 10 seconds to describe your life history. I started doing transport regulatory work in '94, and I've been doing it ever since, basically. So looking after bus, truck and coach operators at public inquiry, defending them in a magistrate's court, looking after drivers, fatal accidents, you name it. I've covered it in 30 years of doing this. So you can see immediately looking at Heather that she's not had 30 years of this. But go on, Heather, you say your bit.
So I qualified in 2009 and I've been at Backhouse Jones for the last 9 years. So predominantly acting for operators, bus coach, HGV, specialising in employment. So I'll represent operators at employment tribunal as well as looking after them day to day on their internal contracts, handbooks, policies, procedures, and disciplinary grievances, that kind of thing. So anything day-to-day employment related, that's what I will be dealing with.
We just had someone message saying they can't hear you that well, Heather, but you sound okay on my side.
Oh, hang on, I can mess with this.
We'll just tinker with
the sorry, before we get started, make sure everyone can hear okay.
I've never known anybody not hear me. That doesn't really do much. Okay.
Thumbs up now.
To be fair, I can hear Heather. We're very familiar in this office with hearing Heather.
Okay, great. So we'll get started now. Thank you, guys. I'm just going to share my screen. Everyone should be able to see that. So yeah, as I said before, thank you so much for joining today's webinar about bridge strikes in partnership with our affinity partner, Backhouse Jones. We'll be discussing why bridge strikes are happening and what the HR implications are for your business.
Yeah, you can't see your screen. It's not
good. Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. What's going on?
That's it. It's coming.
Great. Okay.
Yeah.
Apologies. I will skip this one because you just heard me say that. But basically, everyone attending should be aware of what FORS is. However, for those of you that aren't, we are the leading fleet accreditation scheme in the UK. We focus on road safety, operational efficiency, and environmental protection. It includes specific requirements on vulnerable road user safety, helps improve operational performance, and demonstrates best practice. We use a tiered approach to show your accreditation level, with gold being the highest, silver intermediate, and bronze entry level. So those of you that didn't join at the start of the webinar, the presenters today are James Backhouse, Director of Backhouse Jones, and Heather Lunny, Associate Director at Backhouse Jones. James specialises in road transport law with almost 30 years experience, and Heather specialises in employment issues for the road transport sector. So over to you, James.
Okay, so we're splitting this into two halves just to cover. It's really about 2/3, 1/3. So you'll hear, unfortunately for you, from me for 2/3 of this, and then at the end you'll hear about 1/3 from Heather on the HR consequences. Just talking about bridge strikes and why it's an issue, let's look at the background to them. Essentially, if we flip slides, you can see that the real underlying risk of a bridge strike is obviously serious injury or fatal accident involving passengers or the driver of the vehicle concerned, or passengers or drivers in other vehicles, or indeed pedestrians and other road users. And in an absolutely horrific situation, it could also involve a serious accident involving the train, which has happened, albeit I think it was in the 1970s the last time there was a train accident as a result of a bridge strike. So ultimately, at the top of all this, it is the avoiding that is the purpose of focusing attention on bridge strikes and the mitigation measures which are expected to take as operators to reduce your risk of being involved in one. This particular accident was just a very bad accident, and the judge really sums it up quite well at the end when he says the stark reality in this case is that the driver's impatience that day robbed him of the care which ordinarily he applied to his professional driving. In other words, in a roundabout way, the judge in that case was saying, look, a good driver can have a bad day, and unfortunately, if they end up killing somebody, they will end up with a serious conviction and a prison sentence, as well as obviously living with the consequences of their error. So that's the high level, the top end of why we look at this. If we move on slides, the next issue really in relation to this, the slides aren't moving. I don't know whether, there we go, it's done. The next thing to look at is what is a bridge strike. It might seem obvious, okay? It is obviously where a vehicle collides with the infrastructure that is associated with a bridge. It doesn't necessarily mean the vehicle hits the deck of the bridge. They will still regard it as a bridge strike if it hits the side of the bridge, or if it's one of those arched bridges which has a channel for larger vehicles and the vehicle doesn't negotiate the channel successfully and ends up hitting any part of the bridge in that context. All of those are bridge strikes. And probably the most unusual example of a bridge strike that I've ever had was a bridge which was a humpback bridge going into a village where a low loader specialist trailer, you know, over long, very small wheels, etc., beached itself on the hump of the humpback bridge and thereby closed the road. So that was on the top of the bridge rather than underneath the bridge. That is unusual. It was a very particular set of facts. But that does still, for if it's a network rail bridge, they will count that potentially as a bridge strike because it could damage the bridge. But typically the bridge strike involves bridges on which the rail is going over the top of the road. Okay, so let's move on to the next slide and look at a little bit more detail of the background to this. The issue for bridge strikes is very much, the slide hasn't moved. It seems to be taking forever to move slides. Is it frozen?
It's moving on my side.
There, it's done. Okay. The national picture for bridge strikes is demonstrated here. Now, I always find this series of graphs slightly amusing. If you look at it, you'll see that approximately 2,000 bridge strikes occur every year and have done since 2017 and 18, which is as far back as we've taken these figures. You'll see that there was a dip in 1920, 2021, but it doesn't take a rocket scientist to work out why that might have been. Clearly, those were the two most impacted periods from COVID. And since bridge strikes often occur during the winter period more than in the summer period, it is quite likely that the impact in both 2019, 20 and 2021 is only reduced as a result of COVID. Why do I find that amusing? Well, really, roughly over this 5-year period, there's been a continuous and relentless focus on avoiding bridge strikes by the Office of the Traffic Commissioner and Network Rail, with all sorts of publications, various training sessions, action taken against drivers, very visible action taken against operators, with one licence being revoked as a result of a failure to address the issue following a previous incident. And yet it's made no difference to the underlying statistics whatsoever. We are effectively running at exactly the same level. Because although 2,000 sounds a lot in a given year, in practice, given the number of large vehicles travelling under bridges every day, every hour of every day, it's an absolutely minuscule number. And I have a view myself that you are probably here looking at the lowest common denominator of human failing, and there's really not much more you can do with training and attention drawing. Drivers already know they're not supposed to take a vehicle that's too tall under a low bridge. I mean, nobody deliberately drives into a bridge in the normal course of driving. So the reality is it may well be that there isn't much that we can do. I actually think, though, in the end, that technology will probably be the solution, and we'll turn on to that. So why are they such an issue? Well, I've already focused on the high level, which is obviously the risk of death and serious injury. But even at more intermediate levels, there is a substantial financial cost to the rail network as a result of a bridge strike, even a more minor one. They will typically, having notified, and I'll talk to you about that in a second, they will close the railway over the top or run trains at very slow speed over the railway at the top until an engineer has approved the restoration of normal service. That creates delays on the network. We have a very congested rail network in the UK, particularly at peak times. And if there are delays on the network, you will know, if you've travelled by train often enough, that there is a delay repay system, and you get your money back from the train operating company, and the train operating company will seek recompense from that contractually from the rail operating companies, which are, I think, is now all Network Rail. And so there's a huge cost. And you can imagine if you stop a mainline train, I don't know, Manchester to London, which is a very expensive train to catch, or Preston to London, that would, you know, very quickly escalate into very large figures. And if you stop several, you know, you easily can be getting towards the millions of pounds over time. So it makes a huge difference financially, and that money will seek to be recovered from your insurer down the line, potentially. The delays also cost just in and of themselves. You might miss a court hearing, you might miss a medical appointment, you might miss something significant in another way, so it's very bad from that point of view. Reputational harm as an operator. There are two sides to this. One, there's your own name plastered on the side of your own vehicle, which has hit a low bridge and which is then featuring either at a high level in the local media or worse still on the national news. Even a no injury bridge strike can make the national news on a slow news day. And the reality is, if there's any sort of catastrophe involved, then it's going to make the national news and your branding is going to be all over it. So that's direct reputational harm. But indirect reputational harm, which is often more damaging, is if your business involves operating vehicles branded up for somebody else. I don't know, like one of the main retailers who have a very high profile brand and they're very protective of that brand. Those retailers may drop you like a hot potato as a carrier for them if they see their trailer under a bridge having hit it on the national media. So indirectly, it will cost you a contract. That is well known to happen, and a huge reputational harm. There's a risk of prosecution. And of course, the more serious the incident, the more likely the risk. You saw that case at the beginning, the newspaper article, or sorry, the website article. That is the extreme end, causing death by dangerous driving, prosecution against the driver. Potentially, there's manslaughter or corporate manslaughter against people, the driver or people other than the driver engaged in the business, who maybe in a particular set of facts should have done more to prevent an incident or routed somebody incorrectly under a low bridge. So the risk of prosecution at the top end is very high. More minor incidents often don't involve prosecution at all of the driver even. They will always commit the offence of breaching the sign above the bridge that prevents vehicles above a certain height going under it. But they often are not prosecuted, but they can be. Finally, just the inconvenience, time, cost of sorting it out. As you'll hear in a moment, what you're expected to do is quite onerous, and if you are undertaking that, you'll be expected to take quite a few steps. So let's look at the next slide. There are two categories for that. The slide's stuck again, I think. Sorry, the role of the Traffic Commissioner. Sorry, I'll deal with that first. The Traffic Commissioner got involved because Network Rail wrote to the Traffic Commissioners. I think it was Sir Peter Hendy was in charge of Network Rail for a time. He may still be, for all I know. I'm not au fait with Network Rail at all. But he is familiar with the Traffic Commissioner's role, their role in regulating operators. And he therefore decided to, instead of using their own in-house police force to enforce bridge strikes, as the rail infrastructure does have the British Transport Police, but still, instead, he wrote to the Senior Traffic Commissioner and asked the Traffic Commissioner to effectively discipline his operators into not hitting Network Rail's bridges. The Traffic Commissioner in turn wrote to all operators. Everyone will have received a letter. I think it was August 2020 it was sent out, telling you that this is a risk, that they're onto it, that they could consider a repute issue, which means it affects your operator's license, and listing some very basic steps which they're expected all operators to take. And from then on, traffic commissioners will call a driver up every time a bridge is hit, and will call an operator up most times. But I'll talk to you about that in a second. So let's have a look at the next slide. So if you have a vehicle that's involved in a bridge strike, we'll talk about prevention in a minute, but if you have a vehicle that's involved in a bridge strike, it's very important to understand that you're engaged in a process where there's quite a lot of expectation on you as an operator. First of all, the driver. Well, it's an accident, a collision like any other. It's a collision with an object which may or may not be damaged, but you can't form a view of that yourself as a driver, and therefore you have notification obligations. The police should be informed because the owner of the property will not be present. And in any event, if anybody's injured, of course, they have to be informed. The rail operating company will, if it's a railway bridge, will be informed by the driver, again, immediately, using the information on a plaque that is attached to the bridge for that purpose. So it'll give them a number to ring, and it'll give them a bridge code to identify the particular bridge, and they will then engage an engineer to assess the damage and so on, presumably with a conversation with the driver. The driver may also have to attend to other people who might be involved in the incident. They might have to establish whether the vehicle has to stay put. It might be stuck under the bridge. It might present a hazard to road users who are nearby, who might not see it until too late, and so on. So it's quite a complicated picture for the driver. If the driver's got a phone, it's worth them taking photographs of any damage to the vehicle, to the bridge, to any other vehicle, but that's a secondary priority. The driver does, once they've informed the authorities, need to inform you, and then just gather witness information or what have you, as you'd normally expect in accordance with your normal post-accident training for drivers. As far as the operator is concerned, as soon as you're notified of the bridge strike incident, it's important to make sure your insurers are informed in accordance with the terms of your insurance policy. You need to tick that box pretty sharpish. Make sure the driver has done the right thing by way of Network Rail notification, or if it's not Network Rail, whoever else has got a plaque on the bridge. Some don't have a plaque on, and the police have been informed. They may not attend, but you need to establish that they've been informed from the driver. You then need to start a process separate from the recovery of the vehicle and all that goes alongside that, of notifying the traffic commissioner fairly quickly that there has been a bridge strike involving one of your vehicles, and that you are investigating it, and that you will report back to the traffic commissioner. That report you'll be expected to produce within 14 days max. So the whole process should be complete by them. It is a long, complicated report. It is not a short document. It deals with all the training, all the policies, the investigatory findings, the routing on the day, you name it, it's in there, and lessons learned. And it's all the W questions, you know, what, where, when, who, how. I know how doesn't start with the W, but let's pretend it does. And basically that's what you're expected to engage in. Now, I'm a solicitor, obviously. We specialise in regulatory transport law, and we handle these investigations and reports week in, week out. If you are struggling, do seek advice either from us, or if you have another solicitor you use, from them. Don't just wing it yourself unless you're very confident you know what you're doing, having done one before. It's your best chance to avoid yourself being involved in a public inquiry, or even potentially avoid a preliminary hearing, which involves you attending something that's similar to a public inquiry alongside your driver. It is not guaranteed to work, but even if you are having to attend a preliminary hearing or even a public inquiry, a good report massively takes the pressure off you in that hearing. And also, as a result of any investigation of this nature, you might have learnt some lessons out of the process. You might have retrained drivers, rerouted, changed something about what you're doing. Put it all in there. And people often say, well, if I put it in, isn't it a kind of admission that I wasn't doing it right in the first place? Yes, but so what? Nobody's perfect. It's better to identify lessons learned and to implement them straight away and reveal that. You are much more likely to find favour with the traffic commissioner doing that than pretending you've nothing to learn from a particular incident when you clearly have. So that report is critical from the operator point of view, and it's thorough. Heather will touch on later what happens in relation to the driver. So those are the two steps. The driver's immediate, yours is a longer term two-stage affair. Notify the traffic commissioner and then send the traffic commissioner the full report only once it's complete. You may by then also have a report from Network Rail, which identifies what their findings are in relation to damage to the bridge, which typically is insignificant in my experience. Okay, so next slide. How to avoid bridge strikes. We'll understand the common causes. Now, we do training on bridge strike training. It's an hour and a half of a job. I'm not going to go through the whole of that now. That would be dull for you, and we haven't got the time anyway. But understanding the common cause of bridge strike. Two causes I want to flag up straight away. One is agency drivers. They are much higher risk than employed drivers because they're unfamiliar with the work, unfamiliar with the vehicle, unfamiliar with the route, and diversions, particularly diversions. There is a real pattern within the ones we deal with of diversions leading to a bridge strike. And if you couple that with an agency driver, your risk profile goes through the roof. What does that mean? In mitigating this, your risk as a business, you need to focus on those risk areas. Okay, risk assessment is based on the work type you undertake. So if you're doing general haulage on flatbed trailers carrying all manner of different loads, you know, large, small, tall, wide, you name it, then your risk assessment needs to be a pretty thorough process identifying the risks of different load configurations and a policy in how you mitigate that risk of measuring the height using measuring gauges, of notifying that on the driver defect report form, and of adjusting the gauge in the cab, just by way of a simple example. Also adjusting any software you have which takes account of routing based on height, width and length and so on. Route planning. For some operators who do milk round type work, you will be expected to route plan having regard to bridge strike risk for every route. Some traffic commissioners are more evangelical about this than others, but the North Eastern Traffic Commissioner, ex-military, he will expect a high degree of route planning where that's possible by the operator at base. But if you do the nature of the work that involves vehicles not traveling on regular routes, maybe tramping across the country over the course of a week or so, then clearly that type of route planning isn't a goer. It's going to be more about the technology and the information that you give to the driver to reduce the risk. So some large users of logistics like supermarkets and RDCs for other distribution organizations will have risk assessments of the routes into their facilities that you're delivering to or collecting from, and those will be include the bridge strike risk. It's important that you can be seen to be training your drivers on the availability and information contained in those documents and not breaching those preferred routings. Okay. Equally, if you're using technology, and most drivers do these days, if you don't provide it, and there is no policy within the business, 95% of drivers will use their phone. Okay, their phone will not be a typically good tool for mapping for HGV or PSV operations, and the reason for that is that the software is very unlikely to be good enough to compensate for different heights, widths, weights, etc. Now, you can get suitable software, so they might have done so, but it's very important that if you provide technology to the driver by way of routing software, or you allow them to use their own, that you have established what they're using, that they know how to pre-program it correctly, and that they are in fact using it, not their own device. If you've provided them with an internal device, either a standalone device or built into the vehicle or some sort of microLISE system, that is critical. They will expect you to be aware of what equipment your driver's using, and if it's their own, for you to have written assessments of that suitability. Very important, and it's a common failing where drivers use Google Maps and end up hitting a bridge. And alongside all that, training of the planners, training of the drivers, and monitoring, typically at gatehouse, that the right equipment, the gauge is correctly set, that any equipment they take, like measuring gauges, are provided and in the vehicle, that any software has been properly programmed. All can be done with periodic monitoring at Gatehouse to make sure they're on it. Okay. By the way, any questions, just pop them in the chat. We will deal with them as we go along. I noticed some of you have used the chat already. Do ask a question as we go along if you want to. Okay, so those are the key methods of avoiding. Next slide. Magic of slides. There we go. So now Heather's going to tell you all about the HR implications.
So what are the HR implications involving bridge strikes? Well, inevitably, one of the main considerations as part of your internal investigations will be what to do with the driver. Now, your starting point, and we always come back to it, is your contract of employment and your policies and procedures that are in place. Importantly, your internal disciplinary procedure. So if you've not got those in place, then one of the first things I would suggest is to look at doing so. But in terms of once a bridge strike has occurred, the common assumption might be, that all drivers involved in a bridge strike will be subject to your own disciplinary procedure and face dismissal for gross misconduct. But that's not necessarily always the case. How you deal with the driver very much depends on the outcome of your internal investigations and getting to the bottom of what happened, how it happened, and more importantly, why. So in the aftermath of a collision, probably one of your first questions from an employment perspective will be, is it necessary to suspend the driver on full pay pending the investigation? Suspension shouldn't be an automatic knee-jerk reaction, but from experience in most cases, it will be reasonable to at least place the driver on precautionary suspension pending the investigation. And obviously, I caveat that with each case will be subject to its own facts, and each case is often different. So it's about assessing the situation, the circumstances, and making that initial decision as to whether the driver continues in work or whether you stand him down on suspension. So in order to get a full understanding of whether disciplinary action might be necessary, first port of call as part of those investigations, you're going to want to formally interview the driver to get a clear understanding of their version of events. You'll be wanting to check things like their training records. Have they attended relevant training recently on the prevention of bridge strikes? How long ago did it take place? Have they followed all your internal instructions and procedures that you have in place? Did they follow the correct reporting procedures immediately following the incident? We have had a number of cases or inquiries where a driver's perhaps thought he's hit a bridge and has carried on and has not reported it immediately and has done so after the event. What are their employment records like? Have they got a history of disciplinary sanctions? Are there any live disciplinary sanctions on record? All these things and facts you're going to want to gather as part of your disciplinary investigation. Have they appropriately planned the journey in line with your procedures, including using the proper use or the proper navigation systems that you've put in place? Or, for instance, have they used their own device in breach? So, whilst the immediate focus also is on the driver for the purposes of your disciplinary investigation, you also need to consider whether any other individuals might have played a part in the incident. So, for example, is there any fault on the part of the planners or any instructions they may have been provided with whilst out en route? Are there any others potentially at fault or at least partly at fault? And is there a case to answer against those individuals? So it's not just a focus on the driver. You've got to look at the rounded picture and whether action is appropriate on any other individuals as well. So once you've built up a full picture of the hows and the whys and the whos, you'll then be able to consider the extent to which the driver, or as the case may be, any others, it's appropriate to proceed with disciplinary action. In the majority of cases, some form of disciplinary action will be appropriate. However, like I said at the beginning, it doesn't automatically follow that the outcome should be gross misconduct dismissal. In some cases, it might be appropriate, and that's generally where, you know, there's been a blatant or deliberate disregard to the policies and procedures that are in place, despite having relevant training. And in those cases, dismissal is likely to follow. But what you've got to also consider is that the disciplinary procedure isn't just there to punish, but it's also to correct behaviour and educate where necessary. So, for instance, you'll be looking at mitigation as part of your investigation. Have you identified any flaws in your own procedures that might mitigate the driver's actions? Have you identified a gap in any training? Those are all things that you would take into account when deciding what the appropriate sanction is. And each case is obviously decided on its own facts. For instance, it might be appropriate in one situation to issue a warning with some form of refreshers training and reissuing of your policies, procedures, rather than dismissal. And it's fine if that's the conclusion that you reach. You're not expected on every bridge strike to dismiss the driver. Usually, once a decision has been finalised and you've gone through your disciplinary process, so obviously the investigation takes place, you then decide whether it's necessary to refer for disciplinary, and that will be through your formal disciplinary hearing. Once you've concluded, usually operators will notify the Office of the Traffic Commissioner on what steps have been taken with the driver and what the outcome has been. Now, there is an argument as to how much information you should divulge from a data protection point of view. Generally, if you are going to make that notification, you should keep it brief and to the specific sort of facts in terms of, yes, the driver has been disciplined and he's left employment, or the driver has been disciplined and he was issued with a written warning or a fine or and any steps. You don't want to necessarily go into the ins and outs of your internal disciplinary process other than sticking to the brief outcome, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that's an issue. What one question that occurs to me, Heather, is, let's say you go to this meeting with the traffic commissioner, the company are fine, the traffic commissioner accepts the systems, but the driver's then knocked off the road for, well, it can be anything from a month, 3 months, 6 months. Where does that leave you as an employer if you've decided to retain them?
And we've had that. If you've decided on your own internal to retain the driver, and they subsequently go to driver conduct hearing and there's this period of suspension, then you would generally, I suppose there's two options. You give the driver the option of taking some paid holiday to cover that suspension. They might not necessarily have enough, but you could also grant unpaid leave. There'd be no obligation on you to pay them for that period because they haven't got the licence to fulfil the contract with you. So generally it would be unpaid leave or they take a period of holiday.
Okay, I'm just going to if it works. Yeah, you can still hear me fine. It's probably louder than it was. The question we've got that's come in is, do you recommend a company rep attends each scene where possible to check signage, etc.? Yes. In short, you really do want to engage in an investigation that is thorough in this context. This report that I'm talking about going to the Traffic Commissioner, you will be expected to know where the first sign for the low bridge was on the driver's particular route, how many signs there were on the lead up to the bridge, and how well signed the bridge was with photographs. And so on. Also look at things like what opportunities were there for a driver who maybe missed the first sign to avoid the bridge by turning or not. One of the biggest problems you find in bridge strikes is a driver will miss a sign. You know, that's not unusual when driving. If you're unfamiliar with an area, will then proceed down the road and find that they have actually got themselves into a position of facing a low bridge with nowhere to extricate themselves. Obviously, the technique is not to have a go at fitting under the bridge, as one or two drivers still tend to do. Playing limbo with the bridge is not a good idea. However, you may well nonetheless present a large hazard to the road, and you might have to call the police to extricate you from that situation. So it can be tricky for drivers to make those judgments, and training and anticipation of those is what's important. Somebody's asked, where did you say the number to call to hit the bridge if you hit the bridge is? It's on the bridge. There will be a white plaque, usually with a red border, which is fitted by Network Rail, which will give a bridge location, and it's like a code basically, and it will give a telephone number to call in the event that there's any incident or problem with the bridge. That is the number, but don't forget also there's 999 to contact the police to inform them of the incident, or the non-urgent number for non-urgent police calls. If it's, you know, there's no urgency to it and the road is clear. But some bridges will not have plaques on. Network Rail ones will, but some won't. There may not be a rail bridge, there may be a canal bridge, or there may be a British Waterways bridge. May have a plaque on, may not. Your default is to go to the police. If you've had an accident with any static object, you have to go to the police. Unless the person who owns the object is there. So if you hit somebody's car and they're there and they're happy to just exchange details and nobody's injured, that's about the one time when you don't have to notify the police. You can do, but you don't have to. But if you hit a static object like a bridge, the police must be notified. Okay. Any more questions? Let's have a few more questions, or I'm going to make a couple up. So Heather, drivers often in this situation may be retained by you and may be nervous about attending a public inquiry, or for them it's a driver conduct hearing. In terms of you sending somebody with them or somebody going with them to hold their hand, so to speak, as employers, is that something you're asked, whether that's okay?
I've not been asked that before, Jim, so good question.
Yeah.
But there'd be nothing to stop you sending somebody from the company with the driver as support for them. There's no reason why. Generally, during the actual internal process, they would have the option to be accompanied by a workplace colleague, trade union representative, and it might be that those individuals accompany them to the public inquiry or driver conduct hearing.
Yeah, I think that's. I mean,
more as a support than anything else.
As a support for the driver.
Yeah.
Look, the golden rule for drivers, and I've seen so many at these hearings, and if you're representing the operator, it's quite rare to be able to represent the driver as well. As a lawyer, we have to be very careful of potential for one criticising the other, where the other one doesn't accept it. So, but you're often there trying to pull on the rope together, so to speak, because in the end, it's an accident. I'm going to ask you all a question while I'm just explaining this to you in a second. I'm going to ask you a question. Can you just put in the chat, more or less, okay? Do you think that a driver who has hit a bridge is more likely to hit a bridge in the future, or less likely to hit a bridge in the future than a driver who's never hit a bridge? Just answer more or less.
We've had another question in, James. Should we be sending our drivers on the bridge strike training you mentioned, or is the transport manager enough?
Right, that very much depends on the organisation. All drivers of large vehicles should receive some form of training, which you can evidence as to their responsibilities as to the risks of bridge strike and how they're expected to behave to minimise those risks. Whether that's using sat nav, whether that's using height gauges, whether that's what to do it with in a diversion. If you're doing that, then it doesn't require them to come on the sort of training that we're referring to, which is designed around transport managers and more senior managers. It's designed to give you the tool set to analyse the risks that your own operation presents, and then translate that into an internal training, or use one of the FORS training modules for that purpose, for driver training. Now, there's some people who think more, which is interesting. Very few.
Yeah.
The vast majority think you're less likely to be engaged in a bridge strike, having had one. And in fact, that is collectively true on the multitude of people, thousands we've trained on bridge strike training over the last 3 or 4 years. All of them, with very few exceptions, think that you're much less likely having done it. And the reason for that is, and I'll give you a comparison in a second, if you falsify a tachograph chart, okay, in order to hide excess hours for which you may be getting paid as a driver, that is likely to be something which you've done. Well, it's not likely, you have done that deliberately with knowledge, and it is dishonest. The truth is, if you've done it, you're more likely to do it again. Once you cross that line, you're more likely to do it again. And if I have a room full of older, more experienced drivers and ask them to put their hands up if they've never done it, it's surprising. Nobody wants to put their hand up. The reality is, historically, it was somewhat endemic. It's now much less common. It's super serious and to be avoided. Traffic commissioners, though, actually treat it as less serious than a driver hitting a bridge, and I've never understood why. A bridge is just a static object accident like any other, that you hit something that's there to be seen, that you know you shouldn't run into, but you do. It's given that driver conduct is supposed to be not about punishment, but about whether they're fit to drive. The truth is, somebody who's hit a bridge, pretty much universally, people agree is less likely to hit a bridge in the future. In other words, that is not a reason to say they're unfit. But it's for you to persuade the traffic commissioner, not me. At least I try when I'm looking after drivers, which is less common. So let's have a look at some of these other questions. Bridge strike training for drivers. How often? Depends on your risk. It wouldn't have to be particularly often. Once they've done that training, it could form part, if you're more sophisticated, of one of your 5-year CPC training modules, or in some other way, a sort of regular but not very regular training session. But if you change the nature of your operation, the vehicles that you use, the nature of the loads that you carry, or the drivers are changing between one part of your operation to another, and therefore their risk profile changes, you must be able to demonstrate the training relating to that change includes training to do with the increased or decreased or different, should I say, bridge strike risk associated by that type of work. What courses are there out there for TMs for bridge strikes? Well, we offer one, so there you go. And if you book it through, you can see it on the screen here. If you book it through the web link that's contained on the screen, you do actually get a discount of 5% off the price. It's not very expensive anyway, and so that is a good course, very popular. We train loads of people on it. You'll recognise some of the content from this quick run through today, but it's a much longer consideration of the risks and risk management tools, and we provide you with some links and information and tools which go alongside it. Should the company record a syllabus from each CPC module they send their drivers on to be aware of what was instructed? Really good idea, Peter. It's often the case that drivers go, for example, on tachograph refresher training, and they don't actually know whether it covered, for example, the 2020 changes on record keeping. It should do, but if you haven't got any record of what the syllabus for that course is, and it might have been one that was devised 5 years ago, it might not actually be up to date. You should be weighing up syllabus of the courses your drivers go on, not just allowing a free run, especially if you're paying for it as a company. And it's important, really, to make sure it's relevant to your operation, especially if you're paying for it. Surely a driver is not paying enough attention to avoid a bridge, has generally poor attention to driving and is likely to happen again. All right, Alex, I'm going to ask you a question if you want to answer it. Then how often have you been driving on a road with which you're quite familiar, where the speed limit changed maybe 2 or 3 years ago, and you found yourself going at the old speed limit? Maybe it was 40 and it's gone to a 30 before you paid attention and slowed down. I bet you've all done that. Every driver who's ever lived has done that. The truth of the matter is driving is hard. It's not easy. It's something we take for granted. It's something we do every day, most of us. And it's something we do on automatic. Your brain automates a lot of the functions of driving. I have the luxury of teaching my youngest daughter at the moment to drive, luxury in inverted commas. As a result of that, I'm very aware of what it's like for somebody who's never driven before to start to learn to drive, and it involves an awful lot of conscious thought, and even changing gear or turning a corner, handling the steering wheel, something we all take for granted. It's all automated. She's having to think about alongside looking at road signs and all the other things we have to do. As a driver who's experienced, you are likely to have, well, you will have automated a lot of that process. You will be doing it without consciously thinking about it, without going into too much neuroscience. Our brain teaches itself to automate processes, which is how we can do something as complex as driving really quite well as a whole. But unfortunately, what it means is we miss stuff. And drivers generally hit bridges because, for example, it's very common for double-decker buses to hit a bridge. And you might think, well, how on earth does the driver of a double-decker not know they're in a double-decker? But the truth is, from the driver's point of view, it doesn't feel much different driving a double-decker to a single-decker. So they have to be conscious of the fact that on this occasion, they're not in a single-deck vehicle, and they might use a route to return to base, which is a single-deck only route, just because that's what they've done every day for the last 20 years. So it's really important to recognise that it's the lowest common denominator of human failing here that you're trying to avoid, not a particular idiotic driver. Now, it's fair to say you do get particularly idiotic drivers. I had one case where the driver pulled over to the side of the road, had seen the bridge, seen the turning, which was to avoid the bridge, pulled over before the turning, got out, had a look at the bridge, had a look at his load, knew that his load was taller than the bridge in terms of its declared height, put his hazards on, slowly approaches the bridge. He doesn't use the diversionary route. As he's approaching the bridge, the alarm goes off because he's got a geofenced alarm because the bridge is too low, and he still proceeds to have a go at getting under it, and then he hits the bridge. So you do get the odd winner of the Darwin Award if you've never heard of those. But on the whole, actually, they're genuine mistakes, usually committed as a result of or often committed as a result of a diversionary route. So one final question. What time are we at? Yeah, 10:02. Okay, folks, what should a driver do if they're driving on a motorway? Say, for example, it's 10 o'clock at night, and I've done this 100 times, and you suddenly discover that they've closed the motorway in front of you for overnight works, and you're diverted off it. So you're not going on your anticipated route. It's a late night, short notice diversion. What is the first thing the driver should be looking to do? The first thing. I don't need War and Peace on this, just a short comment in the chat. What's the first thing a driver faced with a short notice diversion off a motorway in front of them late at night? I've got some in already. Any more? Type some in. Yeah, all good stuff, this. Yeah, but the most important thing, and most of you are getting it, is pull over, stop. It's really important that they find a safe place to stop, not too far along the route, and then take stock of where they're at. Diversionary routes off short notice roadworks, even if they exist at all, and they often don't, are not always designed with the consideration of tall or wide or heavy vehicles. And therefore it's really important that the driver stops, because it might be they have to go back on the motorway in the opposite direction to find a suitable alternative route. It's very important that they don't plough on and see where it takes them using their sat-nav. So yeah, all good stuff. Many of you don't need this course. I suppose you're on courses by their nature, you get the cleverest folk on them. But you're all right, basically, stop. Yeah, and checking driving time. Could it be an unavoidable delay? an Article 12, it could, depending on when it occurs and how significant the delay was going to be, and whether there was a suitable place for the driver to stop and take a break or rest. Yeah, so there are, but the most important thing is, please just tell them, look, you're faced with an unusual situation, you're going off where you plan to go, stop. Contact the office if that's an appropriate thing to do, use the equipment you've got if that's an appropriate thing to do, but stop and properly plan what you're doing. Don't try and do it on the hoof while you're stopped at the traffic lights at the junction or anything silly like that, okay? All right, so have we got any more questions which I haven't seen? I think we're pretty much there. I'm just scrolling through them. Yeah, the FORS Bridge Striker e-learning for drivers would be a good tool. And again, there'll be a record of that. The e-learning portal, how it records what you do. I was only talking to a client about it earlier today. That's what you would need. Any training that either a transport manager or a driver undertakes, or indeed really anybody in your organisation, please keep a record of it. It's invaluable when you're asked what training. Drivers often don't, operators often don't think that internal toolbox talks or internal training that's done perhaps on a slightly more informal basis is counted. It is counted, but only if you record who's attended and what the discussion was about. You don't have to write War and Peace on it, but if you've had, for example, a refresher on wheel security or checking your tyres or anything like that, which you've done internally as a team, and you put all your drivers through it because you're concerned they're not being thorough enough, make a note of who's gone on it, make sure they sign for it, keep it as a record. It's good for them, it's good for you. Anything your transport manager does, anything of any sort, including this, keep a record of it. It might avoid them having to sit down and do a 2-day refresher on the whole syllabus every 5 years because they've kept up to date with regular shorter training. I think we're pretty much there, unless I missed a question at the end. Many CPC training providers can organise toolbox talks. Yeah, they can. And the problem with the CPC system, the driver CPC system, or one problem in inverted commas with it, is that the syllabuses for the courses have to be declared, if that's the right word, as part of the process of authorization. And that does tend to mean they can be a bit sticky in terms of changing them and amending them. My view is that if you can work with a CPC provider, if you're of a scale or there's a few of you who can work together if you're smaller, work with a CPC provider who can bespoke courses that are suitable. And they'll still be covering the core topics. But for example, driver walk-round checks for vehicles involved in tipper operations involve, of necessity, a lot more care about things like wheel security, bits of I don't know, quarry stuck between wheels, between twin wheels. You know, this applies to all vehicle checks, but the reality is some sectors by their nature are higher risk, waste carriers similarly. So, you know, if you can work with providers who are familiar with your sector, their CPC courses should be more tailored towards your drivers and therefore A, more interesting for the driver, and B, much more relevant for you. And so, yeah, it's a hugely valuable thing to work with your CPC training provider to make sure that what you're providing is relevant. And people are often afraid of doing the same course twice because obviously you're now not expected to do that unless there's good reason. So if there's a change in the rules or the regulations or even the enforcement practice of the DVSA, then there's nothing wrong with giving a course that may have covered a topic you covered in the previous 5 years, but which reflects that change. What you can't do is do 8 times the safe and efficient driving course, you know, 5 times the safe and efficient driving course, which really hasn't changed, you know. So it is important to make sure that the courses that you provide for drivers are appropriate, and that if you're doing the same things, you are monitoring the reason for doing the same thing and recording it, because it's not actually the same. Something's changed. All right, we're 5-2. Any more questions, queries? Hopefully you've got something out of that, but it's back to the host.
Thank you. Thank you, James and Heather, for your time and expertise. Oh, yeah, and thank you so much for everyone joining. I will circulate the webinar recording via email this week. And yeah, thank you very much. We'll close it off now.
Okay, thanks very much.
Bye,
Thank you.
guys. Thank you.